Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another video. This is going to be the last video that we're going to do on World War II, and we're going to look at the impacts and consequences of the Second World War. So what we're starting with here is deaths, casualty statistics. Here we can see military deaths in the red bars, civilian deaths in the orange bars, and then the blue bars tell us what the percentage of the 1939 population of each country was as in terms of the percentage of that population that died as a result of the war. So when we look at things like the Soviet Union, of course, we're talking about over 20 million dead people to produce World War II. When it comes to China, again, it's very close to 20 million. The vast majority of them are civilian casualties because of the treatment of Chinese civilians by the Japanese invaders. Poland, of course, you can see almost all of their casualties, which is almost 20% of their entire population, comes from the civilian deaths, which again is as a result of the Holocaust. If we move down, we can see things like Lithuania. Again, a lot of that is the Holocaust. Latvia. On the Axis side, you see that German military casualties are huge. The estimates are that somewhere over 61 million people on the Allied side and 12 million people on the Axis side were killed between 1937 and 1945 for a total death statistic of 72 million people in World War II. If we compare that to World War I, World War I had about 9.5 million people die on the Triple Entente side, and about 7.5 million people die on the Central Powers side, which is about 17 million, which compared to 72 million, World War II is just a vastly larger war than even World War I. And World War I, of course, was a gigantic war compared to anything that came before it. If we break these numbers down more particularly, just a couple of things that I'm going to highlight, of course. When it comes to mobilization, mobilized forces means how many people were actually serving in the militaries. When we look at Germany, Italy, and Japan, of course, using kind of round numbers, it comes out to be about 20 million people. On the Allied side, we've got the Soviet Union, we've got China, we've got the United Kingdom, we've got India, and we've got the United States and France, and all of that together, you're talking about vastly more, almost 50 million people when it comes to the Allied side. So, of course, that's one of the major reasons why the Axis powers lost, is that they were simply outmanned. In addition, you can see, of course, there the specific numbers when it comes to casualties of killed, deaths killed in action. Those are people who are actually killed in combat operations versus wounded in action. People who were wounded and then maybe later on went back to serve on the front lines. When we look at World War II, of course, we refer to this group as the greatest generation because, of course, when you look at these numbers, this shows you the enormous sacrifices of the people of that particular era to protect the world against Nazism and the Holocaust and fascism and ultranationalism in Japan. It really was a massive sacrifice, and of course we should always appreciate the people of that generation for what they were able to accomplish and for the sacrifices that they were willing to make. Now, that looks at just kind of raw numbers. Let's go beyond that and let's look at some of the other consequences of World War II. Right at the end of the war, in July of 1945, the Allied powers, and here we're looking at the big three, so the man on the left is Clement Attlee. He is the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We see President Truman of the United States in the center, and of course we see Joseph Stalin on the right-hand side. These three men met together in the German city of Potsdam in July of 1945 to negotiate and discuss how they were going to ultimately end the war and what the world was going to look like at the end of this particular war. And so in July of 1945, a couple of things happen that are really important. Number one is President Truman starts getting very concerned that Stalin might not stop his army in Germany and might continue to push further and further west and try to conquer all of Europe. And there was a lot of distrust between the British and the Americans and the Soviet Union on the other side. And so these allies really stop behaving so much like allies and they really start becoming almost like competitors. President Truman tried to let Joseph Stalin know that he was intending to use the atomic bomb against the Japanese, and he wanted Stalin to actually declare war against Japan, which the Soviet Union hadn't done yet by this point. So, one of the things that factors into President Truman's decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was he also wanted to show Stalin that Stalin couldn't just get away with doing whatever he wanted to. The Americans had a very powerful tool in the arsenal to stop the spread of communism as well. So again, the atomic bombings really do have a dual purpose. It's to get the Japanese to surrender, but it's also to scare Stalin so that hopefully peace will continue to last beyond the Second World War. So beyond that kind of distrust, and that's going to be really the beginnings of what we're going to later refer to as the Cold War, we also see a couple of other things come out of the Potsdam Conference. The next thing to come out of Potsdam is they make a decision to divide up Germany into a couple different zones. The first part is going to be an American zone. The second will be a French zone. The third will be a British zone. The fourth will be a Soviet zone. So basically what we're going to see is the Americans, the British, and the French are going to combine their zones together into the new country of West Germany. West Germany is going to have capitalism. It's going to be a democratic Republican form of government, whereas East Germany in the Soviet zone is going to be a communist government. It's going to be a government under the control, really, of the Soviet Union. Now, beyond dividing Germany itself, they also decided to divide the capital city of Germany in the exact same way, and so they divided the city of Berlin into the western part of Berlin, which was capitalism and democracy, and the eastern side of Berlin, which was a communist zone. Now, if you look at the map, you can see exactly what the problem is going to be. The city of West Berlin, which is a capitalist democracy, it really was like Las Vegas at the time. It was a massively wealthy and popular place to go, is completely and totally surrounded by the communist country of East Germany. So, of course, that's going to lead us into some problems later. This particular plan was called the Morgenthau Plan, and this was ultimately a chance for the Allies to acquire what they wanted from Germany. So they were able to take technology and factories and machines and pretty much whatever else they wanted to, in addition to, of course, the labor of German people that they were going to kick out of the rest of Europe. Beyond the division of Germany and the division of Berlin, the decision was also made to really divide up Europe into spheres of influence. The western part of Europe was going to be in the sphere of influence of the United States, and those were going to be capitalist democracies. Eastern Europe was going to be in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, and they were going to become communist satellite states, or what we call the Combloc. And here you can see, of course, it's going to be Eastern Germany and Poland, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania. Those are going to become the new communist satellite states. The next decision that was made at Potsdam was Germans in occupied territory were going to be expelled. They were going to be forced to leave occupied territory in Eastern Europe. And in total, there were something like 12 million Germans that were living in occupied territory, really because the Nazi government forced them to, right? They were supposed to take up this living space, this Lebensraum that Hitler had been fighting for. From 1944 to 1950, 12 million Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe. The problem is they weren't really very well taken care of while they were being removed from Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe in total. There wasn't a lot of provisions being made for supplies or medicine or food or keeping people warm in the wintertime, and so the death toll is really hard to establish, but it's estimated that somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million Germans died in this process of what they call repatriation back to Germany. So that's a huge impact that a lot of people kind of like to forget and ignore because they say, well, Germans started the war, so they should suffer the consequences, which I understand the argument, but these are innocent German civilians. They didn't start the war. Most of them weren't members of the Nazi Party, and so to take it out on them really was probably not the most humane thing for the Allied powers to do, and particularly for the Soviet Union to do, which, of course, the Soviet Union, they really massively abused these sorts of folks. Now, the next issue that comes up at Potsdam is, what do we do with the Nazis that are left over and didn't commit suicide and didn't kill themselves and didn't leave the country, and the people that we've actually got? What they decided to do is they decided to go to the city of Nuremberg, which was, of course, where the Nazi rallies were held. It was the center of Nazi power and Nazi ideology. And they said, we're going to put these people on trial for things that they did during World War II and during the lead up to World War II. They decided that they were going to charge these people with 4 different crimes. Crime number 1 was called crimes against peace. Crime number 2 was waging wars of aggression. Now, this is kind of a strange thing because if you're in the military, you are supposed to do what your government tells you. If your government tells you to wage war, you wage war. For them to go back and say after the fact that this was a crime, really, I don't know that that makes a lot of sense. They were ordered by their government to fight a war. They fought a war. To charge them with a crime because they lost the war, it doesn't really seem as though it was fair. The third crime that they could be charged for was what we call war crimes. Now, this one's absolutely totally legitimate. War crimes, there had been rules for how to conduct a war laid down by the Geneva Conventions, and those had been around for almost 50 years by this time. These particular rules were things like you weren't supposed to just target civilians. You weren't supposed to indiscriminately bomb cities. You were supposed to try to exact as little cost from innocent civilians as you could while still accomplishing, your goals. You weren't supposed to use chemical weapons. You weren't supposed to use biological weapons. You weren't supposed to fake surrender and then ultimately get your enemy to come out of hiding to arrest you and then to, completely and totally, murder them. That's a war crime called perfidy. So those types of issues, those were completely and totally legitimate. The fourth one, however, was crimes against humanity. These were things that were so horrible that it violated the very concept of what it means to be human. And really what we're talking about in crimes against humanity is genocide and the Holocaust. So they decided to put these folks on trial for this. The trials were going to be conducted by judges representing the different allied countries, and one of the chief prosecutors who we're seeing here standing at the podium was an American justice from the Supreme Court of the United States named Robert Jackson. Now, when Justice Jackson decided he was going to come and prosecute the Nazis, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time told him, listen, I don't mind if you're going to go and hang Nazis for what they did, but let's not pretend that this is justice, because of course, the things they did, when they did them, were not crimes. Right? The things that these men did, they were wrong, they were horrible, but they weren't crimes. And to put them on trial for something that wasn't a crime at the time they took that action, again, these are still things which are very widely debated, whether this was a legitimate exercise in power by the Allies or not. So the Nuremberg trials were an attempt to hold accountable the Nazi leadership, and of course now we understand that this is something that happened in the past, so it sets the precedent for what we can do in the future. The next decision at Potsdam was the creation of the United Nations. Now, this was supposed to be like the League of Nations, except it was supposed to work. So, a couple of important things about the United Nations. First of all, the United States is going to be a member. Super huge, important feature there. Second piece, the United Nations actually has its own military forces, which are called United Nations Peacekeepers, or UN Peacekeepers. They wear light blue helmets, and everybody in the world knows what they do and who they are. Their job is to maintain peace internationally and to help to provide security for people who are in danger of things like genocide and conflict and war. The United Nations was again, very much like the League of Nations, so that all the countries in the world had the opportunity to work out their problems together and to help other countries to work their problems out as well. Now, the one big problem that we get from the United Nations is, in order for them to use their military, they have to go to a part of the United Nations called the Security Council. And the Security Council has 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. And each of those countries has what is called a veto. So if the United Nations wants to send peacekeepers to a place and any one of those 5 countries says no, it immediately is not able to happen. So that really makes it a competitive thing between countries like the Soviet Union and the United States and China and the British and the French. And so quite often we'll see that the United Nations will not be able to take enormous actions to prevent global conflicts because ultimately one of the countries on the permanent status in the Security Council will veto that action. And so while it does do an awful lot of good and it does help to provide peace and security in some instances, in other instances, the United Nations isn't necessarily as impactful as it could be. Now, the final consequence of Potsdam is what's going to lead us into the next unit, which is, of course, about the Cold War. Because we develop spheres of influence, one of the things we see is that the free countries of the western part of Europe were very concerned that communism and the Soviet Union were going to come and try to take over their countries and to start communist revolutions in those countries. In response, those countries, led by the United States, started an alliance which was called NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And NATO was set up so that an attack on any one of the countries in NATO was an attack on all of the countries of NATO. And so ultimately this was an attempt to stop the spread of the Soviet Union. However, what we see is, in response, the Soviet Union forms its own alliance, which was called the Warsaw Pact. And this was an attempt to stop capitalist countries from coming and taking over and dominating communist countries. These two alliances are going to be mutually antagonistic towards one another, and ultimately this is what's going to set us up for the Cold War, which is going to be Unit 10, and we're going to start that next week. So I hope that everybody is doing well. I hope that these videos are continuing to be useful to you. I hope you're staying healthy. I hope you're staying safe, and if you have any questions, please do leave them either in the comments below here or in Google Classroom. Make sure you like this video, subscribe so that you get the updates for when the new videos are going to post for the rest of the semester, and I will see you in the next video when we start the Cold War.